With Frank Bohlander, Commissioner of Public Works from 1975 to 1986 by Susan Swanson, County Historian, on June 15, 1989. Good morning.
Good morning.
It's wonderful to have you here with us today. I really am so pleased to have you come back, and we captured you just before you head off to Alaska, and it sounds pretty exciting. You were with the county government for a long time. But before we get into that, I'd like you to tell me a little bit about your own background, where you were educated, how you got into engineering and public works, and that sort of thing. Just a little quick sketch about yourself.
I'll tell you a little secret about myself that not many people know. When I was just a little shaver, I would build little roads and bridges in the backyard.
Yeah.
And I had two older brothers. And one brother, John, ultimately went into the Air Corps during World War II. And he would come along with stones and drop them on my little houses and bridges. So we were sort of destined at that time.
Yeah.
But I sort of always loved building and engineering, civil engineering. And even before World War II, I had intended to become a civil engineer. And after the war, I went to Clarkson on the GI Bill. And I've not regretted one day of it.
Yeah.
It's been a rewarding career. I've loved it. And actually, I've loved working in public works and for government.
It's a different kind of thing. You could have gone in many
Well,
different directions, but
yes, private.
not everybody wants to really serve the public in that way.
No, it was a good time when I graduated. There were 9 job offers, and one, of course, was the State Department of Public Works. And while it paid very well, it wasn't the highest paying, but it seemed to be the one that interested me most.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I was dating then, and it meant staying in the area.
Oh, that was
First things
first.
Right.
So you went to work for the state?
Yes, I worked in Poughkeepsie for 3 years, and then Babylon office of the State Public Works Department for another 12 years. Then I went with East Hudson Parkway Authority. You know, in the state, you have a civil service list, you take tests and so on through, and I happened to be on a list that was canvassed by the East Hudson Parkway Authority, which was the Westchester authority that was created under the Rockefeller administration to fix up the Westchester Parkway system, along with the Taconic. The Westchester system was so antiquated, and it was millions and millions of dollars, and the county just could not see going into that kind of a capital expenditure. So when Rockefeller was governor, they got together, I suppose, the local people here, government people, and Rockefeller, and they kind of formulated this authority, which an authority, of course, can float bonds on its own, revenue bonds. And the idea was excellent, and it would have worked very well. One of the reasons it didn't work was because there was a great effort on the local front here, the people of Westchester, to maintain or to not increase tolls. They had a feeling there would be a massive increase in tolls at the sawmill and hutch barriers, and these people who commute to the city and so forth felt negative on it.
Sure.
So there was a sort of a backlash. And as a result, the state legislature put in a restriction of a maximum of 25 cents for one trip through the system. Well, that's just
through
about...
the whole system.
Through the whole
so
system.
Like
Meaning if you entered at Connecticut line and went through the Hutch barrier, you would get a token at Connecticut, and you could deposit it for 25 cents. You deposit it at the Hutch or the sawmill on the way through, so you paid no more. It was very intricate. And with that kind of a system, the maximum revenue that the bond bank people told us we could raise was $16 million, and we couldn't really do anything with that. So.
Interesting. So you were in Babylon on Long Island, and then you came here.
Then we went to I went to East Hudson Parkway Authority, and I was there, I guess 5 years, when the county was looking for someone to come in to sort of fill in underneath 2 of the older people who were here. That would be Jim Harding, who's still alive, and Ed Delahanty. Jim Harding was the commissioner, had been for 26 years, and Ed Delahanty was his first deputy commissioner. And Ed came from Albany. They recruited Ed from Albany. They called Albany Public Works people and said, have you got someone up there who's interested in coming down? And Ed told me the story. He said, they came down to me and said, would you like a job in Westchester? And I said, what kind of a job? And it sounded good to him, so he came. When he retired, he had 52 years of service. He retired under the mandatory 70-year retirement.
Yes, there.
Started at 18 as a rod man on a survey party. Did not have college, but attained a professional engineer's license and became Commissioner of Public Works here, which I think is quite a remarkable.
That's quite a feat. Is Ed Delahanty still alive?
No, he isn't. He died a number of years ago.
He must have been quite a guy.
He was quite a guy.
Yeah.
I liked it.
Yeah.
And Jim Harding hired me to replace the chief engineer that they also recruited from Albany, who was Bob Dennison.
Yeah.
Now, Bob Dennison I knew very well because from Babylon, the connection between Babylon and Albany, we worked together quite a bit. I would send plans up, he would review them, we'd comment and write back and forth. I knew Bob well, and he was asked to come down and become chief engineer here in Westchester because Ed was growing old and Jim was growing old, and they knew they wanted someone to move up through the ranks, and the feeling was that no one was ready with it in the department as yet. Frank Kearney was still a junior at that time.
Yeah.
At any rate, Bob Dennison came down, took the position of chief engineer. And then he was here, 2 or 3 years, and asked me if I would like to take his job when he moved up into first deputy. And that was sort of the ascension down through. And I moved to first deputy when Bob Dennison became commissioner. Jim Harding retired, and then Ed Delahanty became commissioner for 3 years, and then Bob Dennison moved into first deputy, and so on up through.
Right.
And
so
I followed him, and Frank Kearney followed me into chief engineer's position.
So it's been a very orderly process, and that must be wonderful for the department. I mean, it makes those transitions so easy and smooth.
It does.
And very important when you're dealing with public works projects. I mean, you can't have, that would be terribly disruptive if somebody came in from the outside and
well,
you could do it. But
it happens, and it happens quite a lot. The head position is a management type position, and the staff in Public Works is a very loyal staff and a very dedicated staff, have been all through the years. I mean, through my experience with the department. And I dare say probably the 3 people could go on a 4-month vacation and the department would run right along just the same. I really feel that way because they are dedicated people. I know. I've worked with so many of them.
well, it says a lot for the department. But just to run down the list, as I understand it, Charles Sells was commissioner from 1939 to 41. But according to Jim Harding, he was not a full-time commissioner. Jim says, well, he only worked mornings, you know.
Yeah.
When Jim came on board in 1942, he said he claims he was the first full-time commissioner.
I would say so, yes.
And then Jim was in office as commissioner until 1968. Ed Delahanty came in from 68 to 71. Robert Dennison from 71 to 74. And then you had the next longest term to Jim Harding, 75 to 86 as commissioner, but you've been involved with the department
Since
so much
68.
1968.
Yes.
So almost 20 years.
That's right,
With that
with this
department.
department.
Yeah. Before we get into some of the projects you talked about, I've been absolutely fascinated with Westchester's roads. And unlike you, I grew up, I loved to play in the sandbox and build roads and bridges. Girls do that too.
Good. Wow. Why not?
But I did a study a couple of years ago about how Westchester's suburbs developed, and of course the important role that our parkways played in that. And then some of the first public parkways in the world. Now, it's interesting that you talk about coming in, well, in the 50s, I guess, was at the time that East Hudson Parkway Authority.
Well, the East Hudson Parkway was created in 1960.
60.
Yes,
okay.
I was on Long Island through the 50s. I came to East Hudson in 1963.
So was that the first major overhaul of those parkways? The last one, I think, was...
Major, yes. I would say major.
Yeah.
Because they did add some widening to the Sawmill River Parkway previously, and some barrier on the Cross County Parkway, that sort of thing. And the Hutch had a barrier put in. But basically, the major improvements began with the East Hudson Parkway Authority. The funding came from what they call first instance money from the state. Yeah. And it was one of those things where they put the money up and supposedly it was to be paid back, but everyone knew it would never be paid back.
Now, how long did it take to get those parkways in shape and that renovation of the
Well, they're still working
60s.
on the hutch now.
Yeah, but is that a continuation of that?
Yes, yes,
It
that's
has-
the same money
Okay,
set
that's
aside and so forth by the state legislature.
they've gone-
Of course, East Hudson has been removed from the books and is no longer in existence, and the parkways were turned over to the state,
Right.
DOT, Department
Right.
of Transportation.
When did that happen?
I believe it was probably in the 70s, late 70s. I would guess at 78, somewhere in there. Oh, maybe even later. Oh, yes, it must have been in the early 80s.
So but they felt that it was better to move out of a sort of a...
Of locked in.
Yeah.
A catch-22 is what it really was.
Yeah, into something handled by the state, and it's working
Yes.
more smoothly that way. Wow, the parkways are really sort of the lifeblood of the county in so many ways. And
They're unique, really.
They really are, and of course we're in a corridor there. We're linking New England, upstate New York, and it's always been a corridor. But it really fascinated me that the original parkways laid out by that Parkway Commission in the 20s, virtually that original plan has come to be. It's changed in that the original, what they called the Pelham-Portchester Parkway, became the New England Thruway,
Yes.
and you know, whatever they called that cross Westchester Parkway became 287, and you know.
Yes, some of the corridors were purchased early,
right,
the right-of-way for them.
But
Yes.
the fact that they bought those right away.
That was
saved
fascinating,
the
yes.
state millions of dollars,
Yes,
and
it
that was
did.
really very foresighted of that particular group of people.
It was they were well advanced. They were the pioneers,
They were.
really, in Westchester County. The parkway builders and designers were the pioneers of parkways,
Yeah.
in every sense of the word.
Yeah.
And starting with the Cross Bronx or the Cross County, the Bronx River Parkway. Yes, Bronx River Parkway.
Fascinating story, and I happened to interview yesterday the daughter of Mrs. Roberts Walker, who was one of two women on that original parkway.
Isn't that
commission.
interesting?
Yeah, and the daughter is now in her mid-80s, and a fascinating lady. And I was asking her, you know, it must have been, it was interesting to me that they put a woman on that commission, or two
yes.
women on that commission in the first place.
At that time in history.
Yeah, and she said, well, my mother knew she was kind of window dressing, but she really enjoyed that role. And she said it was my mother who was the one who instigated the building of those, of the gas stations to make
Oh,
them
really?
attractive stone buildings.
That's very nice.
Which I thought was
Yes,
interesting, that,
yes.
that our woman was for that kind of building.
I found a book in the library, actually in Jim Harding's office. I imagine it had been there through I don't know how many commissioners. And I began to look through it, and it was an old book on Roman architecture. And in it were some sketches of castles, towers, and ramparts and things of this nature on these castles, and notes in the margin, and little sketches next to it. And then a sketch of a little bridge showing this worked into the face of a bridge. And I rode the parkways until I finally found, I can't remember what crossing it is now on the Bronx River Parkway, but there's the sketch that was in that book in pencil, and whoever designed that in the early days in the county used this old book on Roman architecture to get the ideas.
That's a great
Isn't that
story,
something?
and that's a great legacy.
I think the
So-
book must still be up
I'll
in
have to
the
check-
library.
I'll
Frank
talk-
Kearney
yeah,
probably
I'll talk
has
with
it.
Frank about that, because the Romans were such great road builders. That's a great legacy. Well, it makes me feel even better about the history of the county's roads. And I didn't mean to get off, but I knew that roads were one of your
Big part of
interests.
it, but not the whole
interest of
story.
mine. But let's talk a little bit about some of the projects that you were involved with. And let's start with the courthouse.
Oh, the courthouse. That was almost my demise. In fact, I wound up in the intensive care unit over in the medical center. They thought I had a heart attack. Well, it was a spasm, what it was really, but it was the beginning of the end for me, because we'd been in the old courthouse, and it's an interesting bathroom would cease to function. And rather than try to chop in the wall and the floor and get the pipes and fix it up, we close the door, lock it, say out of order, and be done with it. And then, you know, this could go on just so long. You run out of bathrooms after a while, and the juror's room was hot, and we didn't want to spend more money on reconditioning the air conditioning, and so we were most anxious to get into this courthouse, and the contractors were dragging and dragging and dragging, and then finally I had just become commissioner, and we moved in. Well, the elevators were supposedly plummeting. Nothing seemed to work, and and the television cameras came up, interviewed me on the plummeting elevators because people were complaining about that, and the mineralite on the outside began to flake off. And I remember very well the problems that occurred on it. Al Del Bello was a county executive at the time, and he was headed for Washington for some meeting. And they grabbed him at the airport, and he said, "No, I have to catch the plane." He said, "You go talk to Frank Bohlander, the Commissioner of Public Works." So they finally came up here, and they wanted to interview me on all these problems. And I said, "Whoa, wait a minute, you better talk to the county executive about this." And he said, "No, he said to talk to you." And I said, "Well, just a minute." And I called, and he had already left. And I got Dee Del Bello on the phone, and she said, "Oh, Frank," she said, "please, you talk to them. You know all the details about it." They were looking for blood at that time. And I said, "All right." So they set the cameras up. And I remember the interviewer was Jim Van Sickle. You remember Jim Van Sickle?
I remember the name.
Yeah, well, he's a great guy. We started the interview, and to say the least, I was completely nervous behind my desk. And we started off, and I began to stumble and stammer a little bit. And cut that. He said, "Wipe that off and start over." He said, "Now, Frank, you were talking to me before." And he said, "It was very relaxed." He said, "Just like before." So then, he just made it so nice, and I sat down, and then I started to go. And I told the story of the courthouse, what the problems were, and where we were in solving them, and it came out very well. I was pleased. Everybody seemed to be pleased. A lot of people saw it and so forth. But it was nerve-wracking, to say the least.
Now, who was the architect of the new courthouse?
Welton Beckett was the principal architect, and then they had mechanicals and electricals and so on. But the arrangement for the design review and the processing of the design through the architect and all of the reviews of it was handled by Tom Dumont, who was a former civil engineer corps of the Navy captain, retired. And I think Ed McCallion knew him through some association that he had. Tom was a good man, very knowledgeable, very obstinate though, very obstinate to work with. I know as chief engineer, my specification called for that I was responsible for all designs in the county. And so I took an interest in it, and I reviewed the plans one day, and I went to Tom and I said, "Now I see a few things I'd like to talk to you about, going through proper channels." And he was furious. He went to Ed McCallion. The end result was that no, Frank Bohlander or no one else in the department to review the plans. You were the man to take care of them. So from then on, it was almost a solo job for Tom Dumont.
But was he ready to take the responsibility for the problem?
He was ready, because being a captain in the Navy is a high rank. But I don't think he gave it the kind of detail that perhaps he should have. And he had no staff. It was just he. And it would have been better, in my estimation now, and of course this is Monday morning quarterbacking, had he permitted some of us, or myself, or some of my staff, to assist him in it. I mean, I went to him with the suggestions on some of the changes, and he rejected them primarily because he was a former captain, and I was a second-class storekeeper. Maybe that had something to do with it, I don't know. But nevertheless, he rejected it, and I think some of our problems could have been avoided because of that.
Yeah.
And the elevators, of course, we had poor maintenance on the elevators, and they had used the prisoner's elevator for a freight elevator. And of course, they just about wore it out.
Yeah, sure.
And then we moved in, and the prisoners started going up and down. And what happened is there were little switches that would make and break. When the doors open, the elevator can't move, and so on. And these were contacting and so on, and it would stop the elevator on an emergency stop almost, and then it would let it go, and it would stop again. So it was really a jerking ride on down, and I guess it frightened some of the people in it. And I really didn't believe they were plummeting. I said, elevators can't plummet in this day and age.
That's right.
Until one of the Parkway policemen came into my office one day, and he was white as a sheet. And he walked up to the desk and he said, "Commissioner," he said, "they're plummeting."
Yeah.
"You say they're plummeting, I believe you, but what happened?" And then he described it. And I said, "Well, we've got to find out what the problem is." And I called a few people in that field, consultants that I knew, and I asked for some names of people who could really do an in-depth investigation. And they gave me the name of an old fellow in Scarsdale, lived in Scarsdale, and worked for him by himself. He's an engineer and had years and years of experience on mishaps, elevator mishaps. He would go in almost like a forensic engineer and find out what happened. And I interviewed him, and he must have been in his 70s then, but I could tell he really knew his stuff. And he took the contract, and he crawled around that elevator and discovered what was happening, make it break contacts and so forth. And he recommended that our maintenance be done by the company who installed the elevators rather than a low bid type service contract. And of course we did. We went to Westinghouse manufacturer and we set up a contract and we had no problems.
And that took care of it?
Yes, took care of it.
Well, it was lucky that nobody was shaken up or hurt.
No, no one was hurt. I remember another incident. We had window problems. The windows were blowing out here and there. And also people were walking into the windows. And of course, if you've been in the courthouse, they go to the floor, and they're sort of on a corridor area. And I sat at my desk one day, and one of the maintenance supervisors came in. He said, "Commissioner," he said, "a man just walked through the window." I said, "What floor?" "Oh, no, he said. He was right in the lobby. But he turned, he walked to the desk, and he said, "Where do I get the bus for so-and-so?" And the policeman sitting at the desk said, "Right across the street." He turned and he walked, and of course it was just one big plate glass, and he walked right through the window. He wasn't hurt, but it scared me. I thought he came right out. I could just vision him going, taking a nosedive. Of course, then we had young people, I presume they were young people, taking shots at the windows on the south side of the courthouse tower, and they were coming from the Ferris Avenue area, and those windows ran several $1,000s a pop.
Oh my gosh.
And so we were having window problems for a while.
Oh, I guess so. That finally calmed down.
The skin of the courthouse is what they call a mineralite. It's like the same material that the White Cliffs of Dover consist of. And they mix this up. It makes some sort of a mortar out of it, like a plaster, and they put that on. It's a problem because it's porous and water gets inside, and you have freezing and thawing, and it pops off. Not a great selection, and right from day one we had problems with it. We've redone the courthouse in here and there in spots, and you can see them if you look up. It's beginning to look patchy.
No.
That occurred, unfortunately, because the bids came in higher than the referendum allowed bonding for. And the decision was to go back to the boards and change it. It was originally sandstone. And so we switched to mineralite, which is a plastered material, rather than the sandstone. And unfortunately, it was an economic choice, and it was not a good one, and we're still suffering. And right now, Frank Kearney has a study to redo the exterior. Just how that'll go, I don't know. It's millions. It's a big job.
Oh, I think so.
It's a big job.
I suppose air pollution doesn't help with the.
I don't know. Well,
emissions
possibly
of,
does it, but it's just
moisture.
basically the moisture and the freezing. It happens each spring. We begin to see pieces coming off. In fact, when it originally happened, pieces were coming down over the entranceway, and I immediately ordered an emergency contract and had 2 layers of 3-inch plank and a walkway, like a tunnel almost, built from the walkway right out and roped off all around the courthouse, so no one could walk there till we had a contract to go up and knock loose all that was loose and redo it.
Oh, that was
What's called an emergency contract.
Oh, gosh.
Scary, though.
Yeah, it is.
But basically, the courthouse has worked out well. There were a great deal of criticism early on concerning the layout, how the prisoners are brought in and out, and access to the judges' chambers, the courtrooms, and so on. But you have to understand, when the courthouse was designed, the judges, chief administrative judge, and some of the other committee of judges were all assembled and discussed and reviewed and so forth. And of course their comments were taken seriously, but we didn't live in an area of terrorism like we did subsequent to the construction of it. People respected the courts, and they respect it more so than they do now. And I think that's why the criticism came, because we had a change of social...
That's right. It had nothing to do with,
right.
I mean, you were designing according to the tenets of the day.
Right.
Who would have ever dreamed of the horrors that are happening in...
It could, if you had a really far-seeing architect who might have said, well, someday there might be problems along this line. If he was a sociologist as well as an architect, he might have foreseen this. But that's asking an awful lot of your average architect. I think Weltenbecker did a fairly good job. There was some economies that shouldn't have been put in, but at that time people were anti-referendum. They were anti-spending.
Yes.
I guess that would have been the late 50s. Things were tight, and so we put on what they call a flex wood on the courtrooms. Instead of wood, it's plaster with a very thin sheet of wood, almost a veneer, that's wallpapered on. Of course, with the leaks we developed because of the mineralite, that the plaster flaked and flex wood came off, and oh, it looked terrible. I mean, it just made me sick to go and see some of these places.
Well, what can you do? You have to deal with the money the public's willing to give you, and that's the bottom line.
And as commissioners and staff people, we don't decide that you go back for more money with a referendum. That's a political decision.
Exactly.
And rightly so.
Yeah.
I think at that time it might, well, and Ed McCallion was an astute person in that area. He knew the public, and he knew what to do. And it was his strong feeling, and the boards, we had a board of supervisors then, not a legislature. And they decided, no, we will not go back for more money. We'll just see what we can do. And that's what we could do.
Yeah. Well, of course, now the county center is another
Is that another
project.
Problem?
Well, no, but I mean, it was a referendum.
Yes, it was a referendum.
And they you know, I think perhaps there's a sense now, from what I gather in my work, of an understanding of preservation in a sense that didn't exist. I know there was opposition to pulling down the old courthouse, but that was at a period when people didn't balk so much as pulling down the old.
No, there wasn't the movement.
No, they didn't balk at pulling down the old and building the new. The thing was, lock the door in the bathroom. We want a new building, new facilities, and we can't make do with the old. That's changed to a large point now, where people are saying,
restoring.
Yeah,
and they should, rightly so. I think it's a great idea.
And they've understood over time that they can keep the old buildings and renovate the interiors and get the best of both.
Yes.
You know.
The problem with the courthouse, the old courthouse, it was a conglomerate of buildings from different ages, and it really, the only really good building worth saving for historical purposes was the first courthouse in the middle.
Yeah.
And if land were, shall we say, cheap or whatever, available, if there wasn't this big push for White Plains urban renewal and struggling, they were really like struggling at the time. I think it might have been nice to leave that building in the middle and develop some sort of a park around it. That would have been super. But it wasn't to be. It wasn't the temper of the time. No. And I did one thing on my own. I hired a photographer, a historical photographer, and I took, it must have been 100 plates of the interior and exterior of the courthouse building, of everything. I said to him, now take everything that could be reasonably expected to be preserved, or that you want to go back and say, well, what did it look like? The interiors of the courtrooms, any particular artwork or woodwork that's carvings or whatever, and the rotunda, all that, and the marble and so forth. Take everything. And we put these in cardboard boxes and sealed them up. And I believe now, I'm not sure whether I turned them over to the historical people or whether they're still in the file in Public Works, but there is a record of where they are. And you should certainly look for those. Well, they may be at the archives. We do have a county archivist now and an archives, and I know he's been working with some of the departments. And I don't know whether he's gotten to Public Works yet or not, but I'm sure that'll be a very precious record. Well, I'm sure Frank knows about it. Yeah. And if Frank doesn't, then the records would show where it's been distributed. Because I know it was in the file for a while, and before I left, I said, I think we have to have this in someone else's file. Yeah. It's not Public Works anymore, it's posterity. Yeah, well, but it's interesting that you did that. In one of the interesting stories I love about the courthouse, Bill Bassani was the building commissioner, I believe, of the city of White Plains. And down in the basement, there was a safe. It must have been 8 feet high and 5 feet wide, and about 4 feet deep, 2 big doors. And we had a combination, but the first 4 numbers were missing. So I called, Bob Wright was Commissioner of Correction, and I called Bob. I said, Bob, do you have any safe crackers in there? And he said, no, they're all druggies now. And I said, well, gee, that's too bad. So I called Molger's safe people, and I told them the problem. They said, okay, it's going to cost you. I said, I don't care. Send them up. So they sent a fellow up, and he drilled out and opened the doors, and there was nothing in it. But here was this big safe in the basement. And it stayed there, and we moved out, took all the things we wanted out of the courthouse and so forth. And then Bill called me up one day. They were about ready to demolish the courthouse for the shopping center. And he said, Frank, he said, when are you going to get that safe out of there? I said, hey, how do I get the safe out of it? I said, I think they built it. It was in the basement. And he said, well, you got to get it out of there. And I said, well, where it's sitting is going to be under the north half of Martine Avenue when you guys finish. I looked at the map. I said, what do you say we just flop it over and it'll be under Martine Avenue? He said, well, he said, okay, but he said, don't tell anybody.
Oh.
So here it is on tape. But that's where the safe is, under Martine Avenue.
Oh,
this enormous
well,
safe.
Well, it would have cost, it would have been impossible to get it out.
Well, that's the way. And as we lived in the courthouse during the last days, it was, as I said, we'd close a bathroom now and then and so forth. And the heating plant for this building, the McCallion office building, and the courthouse complex was under what was formerly the jail. They tore the jail down. It was a parking lot, but under there was a tremendous room with these massive boilers in there. And the tanks that they took the crude oil into, or the fuel oil into, leaked. And so they built these, first they lined it and it didn't work. And then they built a block enclosure and filled the block enclosure with sand. And of course it still leaked. It was porous. And this was just stopgap. Till we knew we were going in. They were building the courthouse. You could see it. And the sand would fill with oil, and then they had a little drain sump, and they'd collect, I didn't know they were doing this, but the men who, the boiler plant operators, were public works people, would take a pail of it and go over and dump it in the sump pump. Of course, the sump pump pumped out the water up into the street drain, down through Martine into the Bronx River. And Bill Borghardt was environmental commissioner here, and or rather Cal Weber was the environmental director of the health department. And he had been trying to find out who was dumping oil in the Bronx River for like a year, I guess, maybe, or 6 months anyway. And he couldn't trace it. So one day we had a real cold snap and the street drain froze up here somewhere or other, and they discovered that oil was all mixed in with it, and they traced it back, and the city people told him, and then one thing led to another. And the phone rang one day on my desk, and it's Cal Weber. This is Cal. I said, yeah, Cal, what can I do for you? He said, well, he said you could quit dumping oil in the Bronx River. I said, what are you talking about? And then he told me the story, and I said, really? Oh, gee. I said, well, we'll have to do something. I said, I know. I'll have to get some contract out, and we'll have to do some work with a scavenger and so forth. I said, I ought to be able to do that in 2 or 3 weeks. He said, I'll give you 3 days. Just like that. And I said, all right, Cal. So sure enough, 3 days, we had an emergency contract, and we got a scavenger to take the oil in 55-gallon drums. Then we had to rig an electric hoist down through the hole to get them up. And I welded a plate over the sump so my men wouldn't be tempted to dump in there. But that was a funny one. Later, Cal became our deputy commissioner of solid waste. I figured a guy that was that straight and that honest and that dedicated, he'd be a good commissioner.
Yeah, well, I'm sure he was. Tell me about the medical center.
Oh, that was fun. I came as chief engineer, and Ed Delahanty was the commissioner, and Bob Dennison became the first deputy commissioner. And we had these meetings. They created a sort of a task force to spearhead the medical center and work on the design, how big it was going to be, what departments were going to be here, there, and everywhere, even where it was going to be on grasslands, how much of the old hospital, and so on.
Now, was this to house the New York Medical College?
Yes, it was. It was a combination. It was a combination. It was a teaching facility. It was really, the original plan was an H-shaped building with one tower, the medical college teaching facilities, basic medical teaching facilities, and the other was the teaching hospital, the medical center itself. And they created the task force. The task force was Ed Delahanty, and he always brought me along to carry his bags, and Sid Delson from the Health Facilities Corporation, which was formerly the Hospital and Health and Hospital Facilities Corporation, a state agency that assisted municipalities and other people to build health facilities, be they a hospital or a nursing home or whatever. And Sid was an architect with the state, and Ben Dinnan, Commissioner of Hospitals. Well, we went to several meetings in the city. We'd have meetings about, twice a month, the planning meetings, and each department would come in and present from the college what they wanted, and from the hospital Grasslands Hospital. And there would be some discussions of the architect and so on. The architect originally was C.F. Murphy from Chicago, and he was selected through the state process and so forth. But the feeling in the county was we wanted a local person to be involved, and Jim Lothrop of Lothrop Associates became the local contact. Ultimately, he designed the hospital. C.F. Murphy kind of bowed out. But we went to several meetings, and Ed finally said to me one day, going down on the train, he said, "You know, Frank, I'm getting too old for this sort of thing." He said, "I'm appointing you to the task force. From now on, you will go to meetings. Make it one of your prime responsibilities." I said, "Ed, whatever you say." So then I worked with Ed Denon, and he was a great guy. He retired a good many years ago, but he knew his stuff. He was a small, short, I should say, not small, but short man, but feisty medical doctor. And we had good times together. And Sid was a thoroughly competent architect, all business, all serious. And of course, my job was primarily the contracts and what could be done and with the materials and so forth. And I think because of the county charter, and Public Works being involved and responsible for all construction and design in the county, Public Works had to be a part of it. But it was primarily medical. And I remember those meetings. I enjoyed them. They were so interesting for a non-medical person to hear these things. Let's see now. Siegel, what's his first name? He was the medical examiner at the Grasslands. And we went to one of the meetings, and they were talking about the autopsy rooms and this sort of thing, and the forensic laboratories. And he got up there at the board, and he was going through what the different kind of bodies they would find, you know. And somebody said, "Oh!" There were a lot of people. Somebody go, "Oh!" And he said, "No!" He was sort of like a Peter Lorre guy. And he said, "No, no." He said, "They're the interesting cases." And so that was one of it. Later on, when we were building the solid waste, or proposing to build the solid waste facility at Grasslands, it was a mass burner to provide electricity and steam to all of the 34 buildings in Grasslands. The access road had to go through Potter's Field. And in order to get through there, we had to move 156 bodies. And that was a Public Works project. We put that contract together.
Wow.
And we talked to, and then Dr. Siegel came to me and he said, "Frank," he said, "you know, there could be some very interesting research involved here." I said, "How's that?" He said, "Well, these bodies were buried in all different forms. Some in boxes, some just in blankets, some and so forth." And he said, "We know the years, we know the age. It's great." He said, "I'd like to take tissue samples." I said, "Fine." We wrote that in the contract that he had the opportunity to make all these inspections. And he was out there, rain or shine. They were digging up these remains, really. They weren't bodies anymore because they'd been from the 30s and so forth.
1930s?
20s and 30s.
Yeah.
And he would be right there and take his tissue samples. And I went out one day and it was raining and we got talking and he said, "You know, Frank," he said, "most of these people died from tuberculosis during the 20s and 30s when that was, you know, people were in the Depression and so forth." And of course, Munger Pavilion is the old tuberculosis hospital with the big doors that opened up and they'd freeze them out, so to speak. And so he said, "You know, I chucked tissue from these remains," and he said, there's live tuberculosis bacteria still there. This is 50 years in the ground.
Is that right?
Incredible. And his purpose was he took samples of the soil and he would note the deterioration of the remains. And then he could use this, for instance, if a body were found buried up in Pound Ridge or something, as medical examiner, he would come in and he would be able to analyze how quickly deterioration took place and to what degree and all that sort of thing based on the moisture and the sand or whatever it was, clay and so on.
Well, that's amazing that the tuberculosis bacteria is
still alive. After 50 years in the ground.
Oh my goodness.
Impressed me.
Yeah, it impressed me too.
But the medical center went along some rocky roads. We had problems with funding. It was to be funded with federal funds, and then the federal funds dried up before they could get approval of them. And so then they had to cut back on the building. The original building was as I said, an H building, 2 towers connected, interconnected, ideal. And even the location moved. We were going to put it further back and leave the old hospital out front where it was, the remains of it, and use it for something else. except that the rock was so close to the surface that they couldn't do it. It would have cost an enormous amount of money. So we took some borings and moved it forward. And then the medical college went on its own and built the lower building that's out there. Now the teaching facility is separate. But I can remember the big discussions on double-bedded rooms or single-bedded rooms, which is better for a teaching hospital. Of course, some felt that the single-bedded rooms were better because naturally they're teaching and a patient is there and someone else isn't just sitting in the room, and you could get more people in the room and so on. But the cost was always a factor. We kept watching the budget creep up, creep up, creep up, and so on. We used the existing surgical suite and just added to it a little bit later on, much later in fact. But we used the existing surgical suite because it was new. In fact, that was under construction when I joined the county in '68. And I can remember as chief engineer, Frank Kearney still remembers it. We went on a final inspection. The final inspection is when the job is complete and the department head usually goes with you and you walk through, and that's commissioner level. And of course they sent me as chief engineer with Frank, who was supervisor of construction. And they find things wrong perhaps, or we talk about what's this and what's that. And it was Dr. Romeo, who was the chief surgeon at that time. And he was a bit feisty too. We walk through, and he's finding fault with every little picayune thing, you know. And we come to this, there's like a box out in the wall. It's the hole. He said, "Look, you even have a hole in the wall." And and that was the end of it. I had this awful pain in my chest, and I said to Frank later, I walked over and I said, "Frank, I think I'm in a heart attack." And Frank said, "No, you're not." He said, "It's indigestion." He gave me, he got some Rolaids from one of his construction buddies there, and that stopped my heart attack. But while I sat there, I said, "Whatever you do," I said, "if I collapse, don't let that guy touch me, will you?" He later turned out to be quite a good guy. I mean, you know, it was just that first...
Just the stress of going
through. But those
are
the kind of things you remember forever.
Well, I must say, it's certainly an attractive area. It would have been great to have those towers and all the things that
it would have, yes.
But as you drive up there,
it is. It turned out very...
bucolic and it's a very attractive...
It turned out very, very, very nicely. I know the brick is a little darker than I would have liked on the outside, but we didn't know what... On colors, I always told the department, I said, never pick colors, never pick textures. I said, go back to the county executive or his people and say, what do you want, you know, how would you like this to look in the final? Because I said, you know, that's a decision that you'll get beat on the head forever and ever and ever.
Yeah, that's true.
I think Dee picked the darker brick. She liked it. In the sample, which is nice.
Yeah. But I was over there the other day. They opened up the Lyme disease clinic.
Oh, really? Yes, I've read about that.
And
that's great.
We went over to cut the ribbon and took a little videotape history of that too. To keep it on.
Well, the medical center is, I think, is one of the outstanding medical centers in the country. No question about it. The dedication and so forth, I know. It's very good. Another story. Public Works, you know, is all over the place. We used to be the incinerators of pathological waste.
Oh my goodness.
And we had an incinerator. They built it a number of years ago, and then they rebuilt it, and they rebuilt it twice. And each time they rebuilt it, technology of medicine changes so that you get different materials, more plastics.
Sure.
And of course, in burning them, the mixture is very important to what you get out of the stack. And so we were cited because one of the fellows that worked for the EPA in New York City rode the Springbrook Parkway, and he would see a puff of smoke every once in a while come out of that incinerator, and so we were cited on it. And oh, they gave us an awful hard time on the thing. We tried everything. We had a review of it, and short of rebuilding the whole thing, was ridiculous, the amount of money involved. So what we did is we went to contract on it and let these people worry about it. Well, in the end, that was not a good answer, a good solution, because what happened is, I guess these people got very sloppy, and that's what you see on the beaches in Mount Kisco. They had problems and so on. And I understand now, and I'm delighted that Frank Kearney has gotten money in the budget, and I think they're going to design and build an incinerator, and I think that's important.
Yeah.
Do it yourself, you know it's done right.
That's right.
Well, it's done right.
They're talking about that in other areas too. Tell me about the airport. I did a little history of the airport. Fascinating story, and there must have been quite a lot of building while you were involved there, or had it gone on pretty much in the
It was,
50s?
I would say it was, 75% built when I went there, when I joined the county. But the early days of the airport were significant, and Jim Harding should be commended for that, because he was a prime mover in it. And the idea of having the corporates come in and buy ground leases and pay so much for the ground lease, and then after 25 years the facilities become county property and the rental rate changes considerably. And that's basically why the airport is a $3 million net revenue, net, after cost of operation, which is incredible. Primarily because of this. And another good move was when we acquired the National Guard.
Yeah.
That was outstanding. And just what happens to it, it's valuable property, there's no question about it. And I think ultimately it should be developed into some private executive type use.
We're talking about moving the big post office, the Southern Westchester Postal Station.
Up to the site, yes.
Up to the site.
Well, that's, the property around an airport can be a mixture of industrial, commercial, and various other things. What you want around the airport is a buffer, and
yes.
that's the ideal situation.
Right.
But that was a good move on the part of the county, and the deal we made, and being able to rent the buildings during the period we paid for property. We gave the National Guard, I believe it was $6 million, but we were able to recoup almost the $6 million tied to the schedule of the payments. So it really didn't cost the taxpayers very much money at all.
Yes.
And of course, the whole airport came from the government. The county began to buy it, had the plots all prepared. I guess Jim might have gotten into some of that. Jim Harding, did you talk to him about the airport? You're going to talk to him? Oh, he's the authority on the airport. I wouldn't attempt to.
But they had done a number of studies.
Locations, right.
The Planning Board did a number of studies in the late 30s, early 40s, and came up with some recommendations. And then it was all moot because the Army came in and did what they wanted.
That's right. Well, they built it because they needed a fighter base to protect New York City, which ultimately never proved to be needed.
No,
but,
they never did much.
Well, SUNY College was one of the sites. Where SUNY is now, that was a site. And even up county, they had another site. I can't remember just the location.
Check the camera. Just keep talking. Yeah, they did. They went. Just want to make sure it's on. It's going.
Still taping.
Everything's going fine. Well, they must have looked at about 10 or 12
yes,
places.
Yes, I've read the
county,
study on that.
And there were a lot of landing fields.
Yes,
that had been there and had been used. There had been barnstormers. People flew in, flew out. You know, there were.
Oh, sure.
You know, these. There was even a fascinating suggestion. This would blow your mind as a roadman. But one of the suggestions was that they use the parkways as landing strips, and that at the gas stations they set up lights, like traffic lights, on either side.
And stop the cars.
Right, and that the planes would radio in and say they were going to land, and somebody in the gas station, assuming there was somebody inside the gas station out pumping gas, would put up the red signal, stop the traffic. The planes were going to land, and then they'd taxi off, and then.
Well, you have to realize and take it into context that the DC-3 was designed and built in the late 30s, and we're talking about the same time now, and so they really didn't have that kind of aircraft at that time. I mean, the aviation industry was just in its infancy at that time, and so they didn't think in terms of a 747 coming in, or even a DC-9. Now we have DC-9s coming in.
Well, I think they're going to try. There's been so much. Of course, Harrison has always fought against the airport, as one would expect. But I think they're finally going to hopefully get some sort of a new terminal over there. But
they're working on it. Yes.
Yeah.
It's long overdue. I know the terminal. I've always been under the impression, and maybe Jim could clear this up, but I thought that American Airlines brought that terminal in from Guadalcanal. It was a former Army. Army airport unit building, headquarters sort of thing.
This I have to ask you.
You asked him. He'd know for sure. But that's what I've been under the impression, and I could be wrong.
Well,
Jim is a wealth of information.
Well, one of the funny stories that he wrote a little paper, an essay on that for the McKillian Institute, and he told the tale of some of the early fellows that ran that airport were pilots,
Yes,
and
yes, they were. That's right.
They were Air Force men. I mean, they'd been handling fighter
Yes.
planes all
Yeah.
through the war, and they liked to fly by the seat of their
Yeah.
pants. I mean, they enjoyed that. That was fun. And Jim tells a story about how one of the guys finally persuaded him to go up in an airplane. He says that was it, never again. It was a ride he said he never forgot. But they were, I guess, pilots have that kind of reputation. You know?
Oh, sure.
And Jim bore that out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, he would. He was a great guy. I liked him and I respected him greatly. He was a fantastic engineer too.
Yeah.
He set up a hydraulic study, prepared a hydraulic study for the county, which is still used by most people who design drainage facilities throughout the county. It's amazing. It was so well done in those years. Jim was actually a waterworks man. You'll find this out when you talk to him. But a highly professional man.
Well, that's another.
And I think he set the pace for the department. He set the standard, I should say, for the department. And Ed and Bob Dennison, Ed Delahanty, Bob Dennison, and I and Frank are sort of keeping up. That's what I like about it. And when people ask me sometimes, "Are you glad you're retired?" Well, I'm glad for some of the more free time that I have. Some of the things I wanted to do. Do you miss the county? I miss the department and the county. I definitely do. Being part of Public Works, you're part of every single department in county government, like the hospital, solid waste, and even health facilities and social services. I can remember when they built across the street the district office here, and that was an excellent project. It worked out. Jim Lothrop, the same architect who did the medical center, that was his design, and it's a very good design. It's attractive. One thing I remember walking back from lunch one day, I discovered there was a piece of underside stone had dropped on the roof of one of the overhanging portions. And I said, what happened here? And we looked, and these stones are maybe 5 feet by 15 inches by 4 inches, all stone. And they hang over the sidewalk too. And I said, if one came down, others could come down. So immediately, again, emergency kind of roped off all the area where they could fall and hurt someone and protected where they couldn't. And we began to check. And what happened is they used a lead insert. And lead in the stone has a tendency to begin to corrode and chalk up and get soft, and then it gets loose. And they were hanging on these anchors. So what would happen is the back dropped down and then it just dropped. So we had a contract to go in and put U inserts in to prevent, as a safety factor. It's right up. And they were on the inside so it didn't distract from the building's appearance. It was a good building.
Yeah.
I remember we went through it, and Peterson, John Peterson. Have you interviewed John Peterson?
No.
You ought to.
His name has come up.
If you ever have the chance, Jack Peterson was the budget director for, gosh, I don't know how long, but he and McKellian and he's a fantastic guy as far as knowledge and the county government and so on.
Okay. I'll get to him.
He's good. He's in Florida too. He comes up to White Plains, so he's probably up this summer.
All right.
Find
I'll
out.
have to track him in.
Track him down and
Bob Ure would know.
Bob Ure would definitely know. Yes,
where
Bob
he
keeps
is.
track of him. But he would come. But he was on the tour, and a number of us went through the building when it was brand new, and the social services had moved in, and they were there 2 or 3 weeks. And he was furious. Here was a waste paper basket, and someone had thrown their coffee cup, which was half full or something, and it was on the wall. And it was, and that's the kind of thing John Peterson and Jim Harding, and I like to think myself too, we think of these things as ours.
Yes.
I mean, they're really not.
Yeah.
But we think of them as ours.
They are yours.
And
they are.
when something goes wrong in a building, it's like one of your friends is sick.
Sure.
And it's,
I remember we, for a time, lived in a Levitt development on Long Island. And I used to say that Mr. Levitt used to personally inspect. He'd go down the road, and if he saw a dead bush, he'd have his men back there the next day putting in a new one.
putting it in.
Yeah, so, I mean, it's the same
Well, we
thing.
want the
It's
places to work, but primarily, first to work properly, then to look properly, and to be maintained properly. In
Yeah.
fact, Public Works is maintenance as well.
Sure.
All the building superintendents and building service workers, electricians, plumbers, well, Public Works.
Yeah.
And that's a massive
Now, were
group.
you involved also with the maintenance of Playland?
We didn't maintain Playland on a day-to-day basis, but we were responsible for all of the construction, design and construction that took place at Playland. Any new facilities. We redid the skating rink. That was a big
yes.
job during.
I remember when
yeah,
that
was
done.
an interesting thing. I can't think of his name. Chayet, the architect was, and he was very innovative and came up with some very nice ideas. And it turned out very well. I remember the old ice making, or what they call ice making equipment that was there when we moved in. We put new in, but the old looked like Jules Verne's submarine.
Oh.
You know, the Nautilus there. Incredible, you know, everything brass, bolts, and things all, and they took care of it very well. But it was obsolete, and it wasn't doing the job.
Yeah.
And we did take some samples of the coils in the floor, under the tile, under the terrazzo, where the brine solution, the cold brine solution goes through and freezes the ice. And it was wrought iron. And of course it was in good condition, good enough to not even touch.
Is that right?
Yeah. Of course we took the old, there was dance floors upstairs. They had dancing up there, so we changed that all around and had skating, made a small children's skating area. And it was good design all over, and I think it was great. And then the Rangers came in, and we got involved in changing it around.
Amen.
They had it was a steel bumper all the way around the skating rink. And of course they're used to wood in the garden and different places they play.
Boards.
So it just didn't work out. They had to have that either covered or removed and taken out. Now I don't know what, I think Fred Kearney had that problem when I left to find out how to change it, do with it. Those are the kind of things that come up in Public Works. You got to solve a problem.
Yeah.
It's very good.
It takes a lot of creative energy.
Right.
And it's always something new, I'm sure.
But one of the big projects is a solid waste that I'm quite proud of.
All right, let's talk about that.
I think that it's one of our successes, and this is a historical record, and I definitely want to set the record straight on that, because I come up from Florida in the summer and I visit my son up and I read the paper, and I hate to see history rewritten.
Yes.
And what's happening here, we built a facility that is, technically speaking, is excellent. It works well. It does its job, it produces electricity, and so on. If we fell down in anything, it was in the contractual arrangement that we made with Con Edison. We signed a contract for avoided cost, which is that we would be paid for our electricity at the same rate that they were buying or producing electricity at its cheapest rate. In other words, if they were using nuclear, that was very cheap, and so on.
Right.
But at that time, oil was high and everything was up, and 6 cents was considered to be the bottom line. Nobody thought we'd go below 6 cents. In fact, the state passed legislation that in resource recovery produced electricity, the minimum that a utility company could pay for it was 6 cents a kilowatt. But it was challenged in court, and everyone in the field, in the business, in the trade, thought that'll never, what's going to happen is it's going to be shot down, that legislation, and we're going to lose and so forth. The best minds thought this, and not only just county or us, but everyone also. Smarter than perhaps we were, the bankers and so forth, investors, I should say. So we signed the avoided cost contract with Con Edison for that. What would happen is, well, we signed a avoided cost with them, but then we signed a contract with the vendor, and he was worried about the 6 cents. In order to get him to continue to build it and operate the plant, we had to agree with him that we would make up any difference if it went below 6 cents. And that's where the county is paying some $9 or $10 million a year out of the taxes, the ad valorem tax on solid waste districts. And that's a bad thing. Yeah. But who could have foreseen that? That was a financial, contractual decision and so forth. But as far as the plant, technically, it works beautifully. Another problem is, of course, we were forced to locate the plant in the northern corner of the county, in Peekskill. Peekskill said, okay, we'll take it, after it was rejected at Portchester, it was rejected at Grasslands. We couldn't find a place to build it. The NIMBY factor, that's not in my backyard, which is a new terminology. NIMBY, we didn't know NIMBY back then, but it was
we
short.
knew what it meant.
We knew what it meant. And so Peekskill said, sure, we'll take it, but we want some caveats. And they got them, some close to $5 million in things, that goodies. But it's worth it. We built the plant. It's a good location as far as that goes, right on the river. And it's working properly. But being located so far north, and the bulk of our solid waste in the 3 major cities to the south, cost a great deal. It cost $26 before I left, just to ship it from the southern part of the county up to the plant before you even processed it.
Is that per truck?
Per ton.
Per ton.
Per ton. And a 35-ton truck, you're talking quite a bit of money. And anyway, the transfer station is another problem. They were supposed to have been built and in place and working, and a lot of them are not yet. And that's the same NIMBY factor. People don't want a transfer station. It's hard to get sites, especially along the shore communities. We have one at Yonkers, which is working fine. That was the first one we built.
What's the purpose of a transfer station?
The transfer station takes it from the packer trucks. They collect it from the street, from the household in front of the street. You see them normally as municipalities that do that. The county does not pick up the trash at the street, at the curb.
Right.
They bring this to the transfer station. They deposit it into a hopper, and it's compressed into a tractor-trailer truck, and then it's shipped up to the
Which would
site.
save money.
Oh, sure,
A lot of
sure.
money.
It saves a lot of money, but it costs money to do that
To
sort of
build it,
thing.
yeah.
But it would cost money to, and you really couldn't have all of the packer trucks coming to the plant, a central location. You'd have a line a mile long waiting to dump. So that's a problem. But one of the biggest criticisms I read in the paper, and it bothers me, is the fact that the county didn't know what it was doing and didn't build the plant big enough. Well, we knew we had 775,000 tons in the county back at the beginning. It was commercial and it was municipal. And we tried to get the commercial to either consolidate into some kind of an organization that we could sign a contract with. They were, in other words, the privates pick up from shopping centers, apartment houses, stores, this sort of thing. And they weren't being collected by the municipals. And we signed contracts. We had signed contracts with the municipal, that would be the towns and the cities. Yeah. And they had put or pay contracts. They said, we will give you so many tons or we will pay within 10% either way. Mm-hmm. That was allowable. And we went with these signed contracts. We said, here's your fuel, your definite fuel, to a builder, a vendor, yeah. Willowbrader Fry, later Signal Rusco, and they built the facility. But we couldn't take all of this private because we had no control of it. Some of them had what they call sweetheart contracts with Rockland County, and they were dumping over in the landfill for $1 a ton. Oh, and I mean, our tipping fee was going to be $17. That was set early on, knowing full well that it would cost more. But the town said, look, if we're going to sell this to our communities, we have to have a fixed price to be able to tell them. So we said, okay, we'll say $17 a ton tipping fee. And in conjunction with that, we created a solid waste district, yeah. which we would make up the difference in an ad valorem tax. It was a good system. It was an excellent plan. It worked out very well. The problem was that, of course, this whole private area was left unaccounted for in the size of the plant. And what really should probably happen is another plant should be built maybe in Yonkers and take care of that sort of thing. But it's the result was when the Croton landfill closed, and it was doomed to close. We knew it was going to close, and everybody knew it was going to close. And why the privates thought that Croton would close and not the Rockland County sweetheart landfills or any other landfills, Connecticut or wherever, I don't know what they were thinking of, but they were all doomed as far as landfills are concerned. Yeah. And so now they're hauling to Ohio, I understand, Pennsylvania, $120 or more maybe per ton.
Yeah, I understand. This is just something that I've read about recently. I think the county executive is talking about the possibility of the county building this.
Any way it's built would be good. Any way it's built. It should be built. There's no question about it. And, you know, I began looking at garbage burning plants and processes. Oh, I guess I was still chief engineer or maybe first deputy. Bob Dennison and I would go from place to place and look at these plants. And we were, in fact, I went to Switzerland and looked at plants, believe it or not. Yeah. And they were very successful. But most of the successful ones were what they called the mass burners. They had no front end separation, no processing, all this chewing up of the garbage that takes place, shredders and so forth. They mass burned and they produced the electricity, and that was it. They had a good landfill for the residue, and it worked out very nicely. front-end processes were not what we wanted. And we looked at a number of those kind, and that's why I'm sort of a mass burner advocate all the way down the line.
Can we do that if we built a new plant?
Oh, sure. I would think the plant we built, since it's been so successful, build one very similar. Probably put scrubbers in it rather than just precipitators. Right now they just take it, they have a precipitator, but if they put a scrubber in it, it would remove that much more of the particulate and also some of the toxics that go out. And people worry about the toxics, but you know, I think in this whole environmental thing, you kind of have to balance the problems. I mean, in many cases, if you bury it, you're affecting the groundwater. If you burn it, you're affecting the atmosphere. You kind of have to see where the worst pollution is going to be. Recycling is ideal if you can take the stuff and get it in, but that's a major problem because it involves too many people. In other words, it's not easily controllable.
No.
Getting people, as I often, when they said recycling, I often said, well, how are you going to get people way down in the lower end of Mount Vernon or any of these Yonkers or some of these places where they really have struggle living, just meeting the needs of life? And they're finding that throwing it out the window is the best way, because if they put it in a hole, it just gets strewn all over, and if they put it in a can and so forth. I said, how are you going to get these people to recycle? You know, it's tough. And the marketplace has been a disaster, always a disaster. And I don't want to be negative on recycling because I think it's worth trying, but I think you have to legislate it, and you have to legislate it strictly, and you have to follow it through with some enforcement.
One interesting thing that they're doing with they have found that the homeless in New York are doing a lot of the scavenging for the cans. And bringing them in and making
economics. See? Economics, see? Capitalism.
It always works.
Capitalism.
And
it works.
I mean, some of these people can make up to $100 a day. Of course, they're hauling in great bags of that, but they work hard. They collect them all day or all night. Sometimes they're out doing that. And there's a fellow who started a nonprofit agency to facilitate that. That's working very well. And of course, the county has set up its own recycling center now.
I know Frank has been telling me about progress in that area.
Yeah, that's just about, oh golly, maybe 8 months old now, I guess. But, you know, garbage is just a tremendous problem all over the state. When you talk about what are the major problems, almost always number one is garbage.
Garbage, sludge is a problem too with our oceans.
Yeah, and you know, the horrors of plastic, really, it was so wonderful when it came out. Who would have ever imagined that would have created this monster problem of garbage?
With the plastic, and of course, because of the shoplifting, they have so much extra paper and extra wrappings on everything that adds to the volume and so forth. It's incredible. In Europe, they go with a little bag. They bring with them a little knitted bag, and they put what they bought in it, and if they go home, and you know, I think maybe we could take a lesson from some of these countries.
I remember going to India a few years ago. The first time I went was in 1978, and I was just stunned by the fact that it was so clean. And I thought, here's this country overburdened with people, homeless, the poor, you know, and yet you look around you, and there isn't the litter, there isn't the waste, and there isn't, you know, whatever. And it suddenly occurred to me that that was one of the pluses, if you call it that, of not having a successful economy, because they didn't have enough money to buy things, and they just didn't package in plastic.
That's right.
And if you, I mean, in some of the really rural areas of southern India, they don't even have plates. You'll be served your dinner on a banana leaf.
That's a good one.
They put the rice on, they put the curry on, they don't even use utensils.
Then you can eat the banana leaf when you're finished.
They use their fingers, they create it kind of like a great big marble, and they pop it in their mouth. And when it's all done, they wrap up the banana leaf. I mean, you don't have to worry about burning a banana leaf. That's going to just disintegrate on its own. You go wash your hands under a cold water tap. No wash up, no clean up. I thought to myself, something is wrong here with our society, you know. And the dinner was good. The food was fine, you know. So it's interesting that sometimes it's so hard to predict the long-term effects of what we're creating.
That's right.
Has its pluses on it.
I often think of that. We had Jerry Harris was the county attorney here back under DeBella, and he grew up in the Bronx. It was a Jewish neighborhood, and we got talking about the fact that during the 50s, when we were building the Cross Bronx Expressway, and he remembered it because he's younger. I was working out at Babylon at the time,
Yeah.
For the state highway people, and that was one of my projects. And it suddenly dawned on me that, and I didn't have any idea what we were doing with respect to the neighborhoods, but we cut his neighborhood right in half. And he said after that, the neighborhood started to go down. He said, where you could walk down the street and visit friends and be neighborly and so forth, he said that didn't happen anymore because you had this big canyon you couldn't cross unless you went up so many blocks, over so many blocks, and so. And I guess during the 50s, we went kind of wild building highways. We did it without any concern for, one, the environment and what we were doing to neighborhoods and that sort of thing. So in that respect, I think the environmentalists are right to bring us up short. On the other hand, it's gotten so that there's so many laws now been created that obstructionists, not environmentalists, just plain obstructionists, the NIMBY people, have used that as a weapon against the builders and the doers. I know we had a bridge on the Bronx River Parkway, tennis court bridge it was called. It was actually bridge number 34, I think. And it had an angle break rather than a curve. And because it was a bridge and had tendency to freeze early and be a little slippery and so forth, we had 9 fatalities in a 10-year period right at that very location. And we had to do something.
Sure.
And what you had to do was you had to straighten out that situation and not create it, not leave that angle break. And in order to do that, we had to widen the bridge slightly. Well, the river came down parallel to the road and then shot under the bridge and then down the other side, right where the tennis courts are down in Scarsdale. And to move the bridge, we had to move the river. And of course, the river was covered with trees, big trees and so forth, and we had to take some trees down. Well, they objected to it. And we had to go to the DEC because it was a Class 1 stream with fish in it or something, and had a public hearing. We had the public hearing across the street here in 85 Court Street, basement. And it went all day. It went from early morning until, I think it must have been about 9 or 10 o'clock at night.
Good.
And I presented the county's position and so forth. And they cross-examined me. I'm trying to think of the name of the lawyer. He's an extremely prominent lawyer in environmental matters, and he was retained by Scarsdale. He normally fights the case for the Sierra Club, which is a very prestigious environmental group. And he cross-examined for like 3 or 4 hours on odd, little points of concern there. And they had engineers speaking to the fact. Of course, it delayed and delayed and delayed, and there were other accidents, and we were sued as a result of the testimony that we gave, saying we were trying to fix it, and this is what was wrong with it, and it was bad. An accident, injury, and then a lawsuit. But that went on, and I remember the tennis court. We finally were granted permission to do what we wanted to do, and we did it. And so far, I don't think there's ever been one accident in the area since.
Well, of course, there's been quite a, not an uproar really, but a lot of dismay, I guess would be the way to put it, about what they've done to the Hutchinson River Parkway. Of course, this is part of the overall overhaul. One of the fellows was telling me that he went down to, he got out of his car. One of the county people here got out of his car and was talking to some of the engineers about it, and I guess it's the DOT is doing that.
Yes, the DOT. Yes, they took over the parkways.
And they said they just went in there and they took down those trees as fast as they could. They just took them before.
Well, they almost have to. If they're going to come down, they have to do it early because.
And of course, with that roadway, when it was built, they were built as scenic parkways. The automobile was used for recreation.
Right. Now it's a commuter corridor.
It was, yes, it was not really built. I mean, it wasn't, but it wasn't a commuter corridor. I mean, people obviously went from New York to Connecticut on the Hutchinson Parkway in the 30s, but the point was there weren't the number of cars.
No. And
there weren't the speeds. And life was a whole lot simpler and easier, and there just wasn't the concentrated traffic that you have today. But that road's a through road.
Absolutely.
And I must say, when they blew up that intersection of Mamaroneck Road and the Hutch, I mean, you couldn't recognize it.
No, you wouldn't.
I go home that way, and there were times when I wasn't sure where I was going. It was just incredible. And it's very disturbing to you when things are really taken apart and changed like that, because it's change and it's not the way it was, and and it was pretty.
It's disturbing, no question
But,
about it.
you know, there's no question that it had to be done, and when we've had all this tremendous amount of water in this spring, where the sawmill has flooded, the Bronxville Parkway has flooded, Hutch hasn't flooded.
No, because that was part of the
that,
project.
You know,
Yes, the
did
drainage was part of the
engineering,
project.
And they fixed that drainage, and you may have trouble getting around the Caterpillar trucks and so forth.
Well, it's still under construction.
But the flooding's been taken care of, and I think it's going to be very attractive when they're done. Now, there's one interesting thing that's happening with the Bronxville Parkway, though. They are going to put that, or there's a nomination put it on the National Register of Historic Places.
Yes.
Which is very interesting. Because it's one of the, it was
You
the
mean,
earliest.
yeah, it's earliest, right.
And that's not a through road. I mean,
No.
again, it's primarily an inter-county road. Most people who are going interstate, you know,
Yes.
use other roads, although of course it does.
Parts of it have been reconstructed.
Yeah.
I know one was just finishing up when I came to the county in '68.
But at least those bridges.
They are very attractive,
They
and they
are
should be
attractive,
preserved if they can.
And those, you know, and some of the things are being saved. So hopefully they can have their cake and eat it too.
They fail to realize, some of the people who are objecting to, for instance, the Hutch and the destruction. The parkways were built for automobiles back when automobiles needed a certain capacity and a certain speed and so forth. Things have changed. In 20 years, it'll be quite a beautiful area again.
That's
I
right.
mean, trees grow. There's no
Well,
question
and I
about it.
think it's attractive now. I mean, I drive down it every day, and
But it doesn't take lives, and that's
it
the
doesn't
problem.
take lives, and it's well, I mean, while they've got the construction going, sometimes I think about the poor little old lady who's driving down from New England in the middle of the night, and it's difficult while
It's
it's
very
under
yeah.
construction,
Always,
but it's going to
always.
be super when it's done, and you know, it's part of life and part of change, and it has to go, and safety just has to be a prime concern. But anyway.
We have, you wanted an overview of public works, of course.
Yes.
We have a superb design staff. I don't know if you realize that. We have architects, electrical engineers, we have mechanical engineers, civils, that do all of the work, mechanical work that's necessary to ventilate a room and so forth. And we have, in fact, we had, when the medical college bought the CAT scan, it's very interesting. Bernie Weinstein, who's now the commissioner of hospitals, asked us to get involved and redesign the room for the CAT scan. The CAT scan was a big step up for the medical, and it was. And they gave us a cut. The people who is staff people, not Bernie, but gave us a cut. What they call cut is a sheet of paper that tells you the specifications of the CAT scan. And we designed the room around the cut. Well, they bought a different CAT scan than what the paper we gave, so it didn't work, and it didn't work, and we never realized why. And it went on for months, and they were losing money because things was always down, and they weren't making the money they needed to justify even having it. And but we do have designers that get involved in that sort of thing, and we have construction supervisors that go out and see that the work is done properly, a whole staff of that. We also have, of course, as I said before, the building maintenance people. And we have a whole crew at Grasslands that take care of the entire Grasslands reservation.
Well, what happened with the CAT scan?
Oh, the CAT scan. Finally, we discovered that it was the environment that was causing the problems, not the machine. They were fighting with the person, and he said everything is fine on the machine and so forth. And eventually, somehow or other, we dug the cutout and discovered that it wasn't the same machine. One of our people, and they made the necessary. What happened is it wasn't getting the proper voltage or something, and they had to run a new dedicated line through.
Well,
once we found the problem, it was solved. I mean, it was just a case of getting in there and doing the job.
Well, now tell me, how has the department grown? When you came in '68.
Actually, it's shrunk.
Has it really?
Yes, it really has.
That's
When I came in, we had close to 500 people in the department. And we're, as I recall, I think now it's somewhere around 400 or less, possibly less. And we're doing the same. Actually, we're doing more of a workload. Of course, we've had the opportunity to buy some pretty good equipment, CAD printers and so forth. These computerized assist printers that print out things, and we've microfilm, and we have many more devices. And of course, the whole technology has improved.
Yes.
The state of the art as far as designing goes. So it's made it a lot easier for us. I think where we begin to see the problems are in our maintenance facilities. There you can't go too sophisticated. It's still the mop and the brush and the electrical tools and the screwdrivers and that sort of thing, the road rollers. But we did go into a paving program while I was here. In fact, Al DeBello said, "You've got to save money, Frank." And all county executives say you've got to save money, and I understand. And I said, "Well, Al, I can save some money if we could go into our own paving, do some of our own paving, not all of it, but some of our own paving in the summer." "Well, work me up a sheet and see how it looks on paper." So I did. Purchase of the equipment, amortized over so long, putting down so many tons, cost of, and then training my crew, and we had a crackerjack paving crew. We paved an awful lot. In fact, we paved so much that the paving contractors came in mass. We met one day with Al and I, and of course I could see he sat there, and I thought the world of Al. He sat there kind of squirming under the pressure from them and wanting not to shoot me down right in front of all these guys, you know. So we finally came up with an agreement that we would pave, I think, 750-ton limit on each project, or unless it was a skip project where you went a little bit here and then went again a little bit here, because the contractors didn't like that. We took the work the contractors didn't want to do, and we also took the shorter jobs, the smaller jobs, but we had a lot of those. So it worked out.
Your own success, really.
Yes, and we worked out. We saved quite a bit of money doing it ourselves. We did a good job, and the men, I mean, they just took such pride in being able to go out there and put down a road. And
yeah.
We bought a brand new Barber Green, and I sent the men out to Michigan to school. They were out there about a week learning just how to operate it and so forth. So it was good. I enjoyed that part of it, you know, and we did some work. And then when Andy O'Rourke came in, took over, I pulled the trick, you know. I said, "Go ahead, we're going to do this job, we're going to do that job." Wow! They went out, we laid blacktop like you wouldn't believe it, you know. Whoa! The contractors got all excited, and I knew the contractor. We were friendly too, you know.
Yeah.
I knew them, Bill Bassett and Frank Cooney and all the ones, Nigro and different ones. They came in mass, and Matty Marielli, and we sat around the table one day, and I tried not to smile because I knew what it was going to be. And he said, "What's this all about?" So I said, "Well," and then they brought out the agreement. It was a verbal agreement anyway, it wasn't written down. We brought it out, and they went through the whole thing, and then Andy looked at me and said, "Well, Frank, what have you got to say for yourself?" And I said, "It's a new ball game, Andy."
That's right.
I said, "It's a new ball game." And we went back to the old one again. But I got a lot of pavement down.
Well, you took advantage of a political situation there and did a little paving with the boys.
Well, we did want to catch up with a few jobs and so forth. But
Yeah.
we do use it for park roads, too. Sometimes we help out. There's a lot of cooperation between departments, between the Parks Department and the various other departments.
Yeah. You know, it's amazing to me as I have interviewed so many different people, the tremendous amount of things that this government does for the county. People will say to me, "Oh, we don't need county government."
Yeah, no, they
well,
really don't
what do you
understand.
do up there? You know,
They
they
don't
have
understand.
no idea of the scope of what's done here or what would happen if it stopped.
And a lot of it is why Westchester is the wonderful world of Westchester.
That's right.
McEllion coined that, and I think it's a perfect description. I don't think there are many counties as wonderful as Westchester County.
Yeah, there really are. And
It's
a
great, in
lot-
spite of all of its problems,
Yeah.
and it has problems just like every county does. But I love Westchester. I think it's a great place. I'm so glad I moved here
Yeah,
3
well,
years ago.
well, Long Island certainly has had its problems
Yes,
too. I mean,
yes.
But the thing about Westchester is that we have such a diversity of people, landscapes. I mean, you
Yes.
go from the crowded cities like Yonkers up to, Baldwin, where, you've got more trees than people by far. It's just a tremendous, diverse county. And beautiful.
Yes.
Tremendous beauty here, but so many problems. But I think that we have a lot of talent here. I've been privileged to be on the board of Westchester 2000.
Oh,
which
yes.
was just
Yes, I worked
fascinating.
on that, too.
Because that's
Yeah.
great. They bring in the top leaders of business,
Yeah.
government, private corporations, and so forth to tackle these.
Is Dr. Prezioso involved in
Oh,
that yet?
he still
Isn't he
is.
great?
Oh,
He's a
still
great
is.
guy. I
He's
think
the
he's
chairman of
I like him
Westchester
so
2000.
much.
And of course, he also oversaw the charter revision.
Yes,
Which
yes.
was a tremendous.
Well, I had an
that was-
opportunity to speak to the group there on that one, too, on the
Yeah.
Board of Acquisition and Contract.
Right, and
Which is a
that was
board
something
that
that came out of one of the 2000 recommendations.
Oh, I think it's ready
And
for
they're
some revisions.
incorporating all of those things now, all those suggestions. housing. They were talking about the roadways too. I mean, it's very exciting to work with something like that, where they are dealing with today's problems and projecting into
Yes.
the future and ways to try and deal with these. And there's a lot of criticism, but I think if people knew the talent that's here, both in county government and of course in the private sector as well, and they work well together.
A lot of the people that live in Westchester and Pleasantville, where we lived, I saw this. Very few are sort of into the local newspapers or even reading what's going on within the county. I mean, they commute to the city, a number of them, and they'll read the Times or the Wall Street Journal and so forth. And once in a while they'll scan and see what's going on, but they're not that deeply involved in it. But it's the county and people like Pete Eschweiler who has been working with planning for so many years. And our communities reflect it. I mean, they're not hodgepodges. They're not run down. They're not crummy-looking places like you see in some other areas. They're very attractive little communities, I think, in terms of Hastings and Irvington and Tarrytown and some of these other places. They're so beautiful.
Well, they were
even Portchester, I can remember we worked very well with Portchester and got a number of streets repaved under federal grants for Portchester and built it up quite a bit down there.
Well, a lot of it had to do with the early planning.
Yes,
those early
and zoning.
roadways
Zoning.
and zoning, and they really wanted to. I mean, of course, William Ward, Boss Ward,
Yes.
Mr. Westchester, had a real vision for this. And when they put in those parkways, they planned to build small villages.
Yes.
And they built them to be that way, to be small, homogeneous communities. It wasn't urban sprawl, although there was a time when it could have been.
Could have been.
They were, in fact, before 1920, and at the end of the last century, consolidation was the word. I mean, that's when New York City began bringing in the boroughs, because the idea was that it was sort of a scientific outlook on cities, that the more that you brought in, the more centralized things were, the better it was.
Yes.
And of course, one of the reasons that they were annexing places like Brooklyn and Queens was because then Brooklyn and Queens didn't have to pay the tremendous tax burden of putting in all the improvements of gas lines and water lines.
Manhattan could help them.
Yeah, and they could share the tax burden, and that was very attractive to them. But at that time, and for another 20 years after that, they were talking about turning Westchester into two cities, a lower Westchester city and an upper Westchester city.
What a shame.
And they really were planning on turning everything, well, Yonkers all the way across to New Rochelle and on up as far as probably White Plains would have been a city, and it would have been an extension of New York City.
Oh my!
And that was regarded as a really great new scientific idea. Well, Westchester towns, being what they are, very independent as always, fought and screamed about it. But you read the old newspapers, you'll see Boss Ward talking about Westchester City and this and that. It wasn't a real possibility because it never really got off the drawing board. Politically, it just didn't fly. But the idea that this was something that even might have happened is incredible. And of course, it did. It went in the other direction of small, homogeneous little communities.
Did you notice that when you were in the Westchester Historical Society, the books with the clippings on the construction of the parkway that I turned over to them?
Yeah.
See, I don't think we had in the county government a real repository for any historical archives. We didn't have that. So at that time, I had these two books that were they were this thick with clippings on the construction of the parkways and the construction of the county center and all of these playland, all these facilities. And I had them in my office, and I presume they came down through from Jim Harding or somebody in the Park Commission or somewhere. But I just felt that to leave them there was dangerous because Public Works was getting further from the historical aspects of it. And I was just fearful that I didn't know what the future held, and I thought these should be in a repository where historical-minded people could be involved. So I think I turned them over to the Historical Society with a letter in the file, so nobody could say that I walked off with them.
Right. By the end of this year, the County Historical Society and their library will be located at the county archives.
Oh, that's good.
At the Record
that's
Center
an improvement.
in Elmsford. So we now have an archivist who's concerned with just county government records.
Yes.
And then you'll have the non-government records will be there with the County Historical
then they'll
Society
probably
library.
wind up
So they'll all be together. So
that's where they should be. For someone doing research, it would be an ideal place for someone to do research because you could get an awful lot of information about that.
Of course, they're building a big extension
Oh, that was finally approved.
Yes.
I
Yeah?
remember when they asked
Yeah.
for it the first year in the capital projects.
It finally went through, and it'll be finished. They're finishing it up now. Yeah, they've made a space for the County Historical Society to move from Valhalla. They were at the community college from '80 till now, almost 10 years.
I see, yes.
They used to be down in a little place in Tuckahoe.
Well, that's good to hear.
So anyway, all of your records will be there.
That's good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Frank, it's been great. I've
Well, I enjoyed it, too.
talking with you, and learned a lot.
And I think you'll learn a great deal from Jim Harding if he's up to it. I know he can
Oh,
awfully
he
well.
can't wait.
Really?
He can't
Oh,
wait.
good
I
for him.
talked to him, and I said, I'll come up to you. You know, I'll bring my camera, and we'll come up to you. And he says, fine. He says, I'll put on my brightest tie. He said.
Another fellow that you might want to talk to is Bob Dennis.
Okay.
He's, you know, Bob is he taught me a great deal. I always thought of Bob Dennison as an extremely brilliant man, and in fact, we wrote the what they call the professional selection law of the county, which was a big step forward insofar as selecting consulting engineers, architects, and surveyors,
Sure.
and so on. And it kept it out of the political realm and put it into a strictly professional ability type, and put a citizen board in place and so forth. And he and I were very instrumental in that. In fact, when we both worked for the state, we were involved in consulting reviews. I was supervising consultant prepared plans for New York City and Long Island in the Babylon office, and of course he was reviewing all these and processing them in Albany. So we had an intimate knowledge of it, and he's a guy that if you get him in the right mood, he could give you a nice interview, and I think I recommend it. And he's in Cape Vincent now, and he lives there year-round, I believe. And he might welcome on down. I know he's got a son living near here. That'd be
Good.
great.
Yeah.
I think Bob would love it.
Wow.
Be a good
Every
candidate.
interview I do leads about 5 more.
Yeah, well, Bob would be great.
I've got a full-time job on my hands here. In fact, I'm going to get some volunteers to work with me and help keep us going, because there's so much. And we're lucky that so many people come back from time to time, so we can grab them.
We went to Charlie Sell's funeral, and this is the kind of story about Bob Dennison. And he said, it was Jim Harding and Bob Dennison and I was the commissioner then. Bob was teaching in community college. He had resigned and taught at community college for a while, and then went to University of Southern Mississippi and taught there for a while. He wanted to get into the teaching field. Bob was an attorney as well as a professional engineer. But he was sitting in back of me, he and Ruth, and he leaned over me and he said, well, this blows our theory. I said, what theory is that? And he said, immortality. He said, cells. Delahanty was still alive, and Delahanty was there, and Jim Harding, and myself, and Bob Dennison, and their cells was formerly alive, and he kept telling me we'd go to lunch together. Somebody said, you know, he said, once you get to be commissioner, immortality. He said, look it. He said, cells is alive. He didn't die. Jim Harding is alive, and Ed Delahanty, and so on. And then he leaned over and said, this blows our theory.
Yeah.
Watch out.
Well, you look pretty healthy.
Well, I hope so. I try to stay comfortable anyway.
And you get back up here quite often?
We come up for the summer, and we go up to the Adirondacks. And of course, my daughter's in Jersey, and Bruce is up in Cortona, so we get to see a lot. And I get to see Fred Broge, who's my son's father-in-law.
Oh, what?
Yes, we arranged that.
Oh!
We were both county commissioners here, so we
Oh, for goodness
sort of
sake.
felt it would be good to carry on the
I
regime.
wonder, is there any other commissioner marriage?
Gee, not that
children
I
of
know of. Let's
commissioners?
see. I'm not sure. I don't think so. I think we probably set the precedent.
I'll have
And
to
it's
talk
worked
to-
out. As
I'll
I
have to
said, the
talk to
third
Fred
son
about
was
that.
just born, so
Oh, and Fred is your son's
father-in-law.
father-in-law. Which son?
Bruce, the
Bruce.
oldest, yeah. He's civil, too. And the youngest is a civil in Florida. He
Yeah.
works for government. You know, he chose government, too. He worked for a consulting firm for a while, and back a few years, number of years. And then one day he was working for a consultant on the bridges down here in White Plains. And we'd have lunch together over at the little house every once in a while. He said to me, Dad, you know, he said, he's Florida bound. Right after college he went to Florida. And he just came up to find out if an old girlfriend was the one, I guess, in high school. And then she married a broker. But he said, you know, Dad, I can't handle another winter up here. And I said, trying to go back to Florida. So he did, and he said, but I'd like to work for government. So he put an application into the city of Fort Lauderdale, which he liked very much. And he went down thinking it was going to be an interview. It turned out to be a test, a civil service test, which he passed. And he's doing very well with the city now, very well.
And likes it.
Yes, found a bride in the city
Oh,
government. So they're both city.
Oh,
So it's working out very well. And our daughter is a nurse, so they're sort of
all
all in the
public
technical.
servants and technical
Yes,
kind of thing. Well, it's a great tradition.
we're very pleased with it.
Yeah, it's nice to see him grow up.
It is,
Yeah.
it is, it very, very much is.
That's great. Well, I guess I better turn.
Okay, good enough.
Right.